Hey, I don't know if there's anyone that's going to watch this in the replay or whatever, but I don't give a shit. Uh, this is going to be a read through slash discussion. If any interesting points come up about this book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon by David McGowan. And this is part two. I did part one about a week or so ago, and it is kind of long and rambling, but we actually didn't make it very far in the book. I believe I'm on page 22, chapter 2. So if anyone's at home and you want to read along with me, that's where we're going to start. And if anyone's curious as to why I'm doing this, it really is just to get me to read more books. I have a book that I'm reading right now on the side, and it's kind of serious. And I was like, instead of reading a second book and getting distracted by that second book and forgetting about my first book, I'll do it a little bit differently, and I'll read it on YouTube. And if anybody joins in and you have anything to add, I would love that, because I want to know more about this stuff. I know a lot about music, and I know a lot about conspiracies and that world, I would say, but music conspiracies is kind of a new world to me. And I think that there's a lot to be gained from reading a book like this in light of the P. Diddy story. And I know that he was exonerated on a lot of the charges, but I think that if you look into the music industry from a with a parapolitical lens, then a lot of weird things start to make sense. There's a lot of stories in music that just don't make sense, and we're going to get into it now. So anyway, my name is Jay, or JJ, and yeah, I hope everyone's having a good day. And yeah, we're going to read a couple chapters from this, or a chapter or two, and yeah, talk about it. Power to the people. Call this a counterculture? Everyone there had at one time or another been into Satanism, or, like myself, had dabbled around the edges for sexual kicks. Sammy Davis Jr., referring to the victims at 10050 Cielo Drive. In the previous chapter, we met a sampling of some of the most successful and influential rock music superstars who emerged from Laurel Canyon during its glory days. But these were, alas, more than just musicians and singers and songwriters who had come together in the canyon. They were destined to become the spokesmen and de facto leaders of a generation of disaffected youth, as Carl Gottlieb noted in David Crosby's co-written autobiography, The Unprecedented Mass Appeal of the New Rock and Roll. As Carl Gottlieb noted in David Crosby's co-written autobiography, The Unprecedented Mass Appeal of the New Rock and Roll gave the singers a voice in public affairs. That, of course, makes it all the more curious that these icons were, to an overwhelming degree, the sons and daughters of the military intelligence complex and the scions of families that have wielded vast wealth and power in this country for a very long time. It could, of course, be argued that there was nothing necessarily nefarious in the fact that so many of these icons of a past generation hailed from military intelligence families. Perhaps, it could be suggested, they had embarked on their chosen careers as a form of rebellion against the values of their parents. And that, I suppose, might be true in a couple of cases. But what are we to conclude from the fact that such an astonishing number of these folks, along with their girlfriends, wives, managers, etc., hail from a similar background. Are we to believe that the only kids from that era who had musical talent were the sons and daughters of Navy admirals, chemical warfare engineers, and Air Force intelligence officers? Or are they just the only ones who were signed to lucrative contracts and relentlessly promoted by their labels and the media? If these artists were rebelling against, rather than subtly promoting the values of their parents, then why didn't they ever speak out against the people they were allegedly rebelling against? Why did Jim Morrison never denounce or even mention his father's key role in escalating one of America's bloodiest illegal wars? And why did Frank Zappa never pen a song exploring the horrors of chemical warfare, though he did pen a charming little ditty entitled Ritual Dance of the Child Killer, among many other crazy songs that Frank Zappa wrote? Super strange. Super strange guy. And which Mamas and the Papas song was it that laid waste to the values and actions of John Phillips' parents and in-laws? And in which interview exactly did David Crosby and Stephen Stills disown the family values that they were raised with? We will be taking a much closer look at these performers, as well as at many of their contemporaries, as we endeavor to determine how and why the youth counterculture of the 1960s was given birth. According to virtually all the accounts that I have read, this was essentially a spontaneous, organic response to the war in Southeast Asia and to the prevailing social conditions of the time. Conspiracy theorists, of course, have frequently opined that what began as a legitimate movement was at some point co-opted and undermined by intelligence operations such as COINTELPRO. Entire books, for example, have been written examining how presumably virtuous musical artists were subjected to FBI harassment and or whacked by the CIA. Here we will, as you may have already ascertained, take a decidedly different approach. The question that we'll be tackling is a more deeply troubling one. What if the musicians themselves and various other leaders and founders of the movement were every bit as much a part of the intelligence community as the people who were supposedly harassing them? What if, in other words, the entire youth culture of the 1960s was created not as a grassroots challenge to the status quo, but as a cynical exercise in discrediting and marginalizing the budding anti-war movement, creating a fake opposition that could be easily controlled and led astray? And what if the harassment these folks were subjected to was largely a stage-managed show designed to give the leaders of the counterculture some much-needed street cred? What if, in reality, they were pretty much all playing on the same team? I should probably mention here that, contrary to popular opinion, the hippie flower child movement was not synonymous with the anti-war movement. As time passed, there was, to be sure, a fair amount of overlap between the two movements. And the mass media outlets, as is their wont, did their very best to portray the flower power generation as the torchbearers of the anti-war movement. After all, a ragtag band of unwashed, drug-fueled longhairs sporting flowers and peace symbols was far easier to marginalize than, say, a bunch of respected college professors and their concerned students. The reality, however, is that the anti-war movement was already well underway before the first aspiring hippie arrived in Laurel Canyon. The first Vietnam War teach-in was held on the campus of the University of Michigan in March of 1965. The first organized walk on Washington occurred just a few weeks later. Needless to say, there were no hippies in attendance at either event. That problem would soon be rectified, and the anti war crowd, those who were serious about ending the bloodshed in Vietnam anyway, would be none too appreciative. This is something that in all social movements you see over and over again. It's literally COINTELPRO. You know, they infiltrate movements and they discredit movements, and those that they can't discredit, they assassinate. As Barry Miles has written in his coffee table book, Hippie, there were some hippies involved in anti war protests, particularly after the police riot in Chicago in 1968 when so many people got injured. But on the whole, the movement activists looked on hippies with disdain. The movement activists looked on hippies with disdain. Peter Coyote, narrating the documentary Hippies on the History Channel, added that some on the left even theorized that the hippies were the end result of a plot by the CIA to neutralize the anti-war movement with LSD, turning potential protesters into self-absorbed navel-gazers. An exasperated Abby Hoffman once described the scene as he remembered it thusly. There were all these activists, Berkeley radicals, White Panthers, all trying to stop the war and change things for the better. Then we got flooded with all these flower children who were into drugs and sex. Where the hell did the hippies come from? Sorry about the sirens. I don't even have my window open, It's just, I don't know how much you can hear, but yeah. Okay. As it turns out, they came, initially at least, from a rather private, isolated, largely self-contained neighborhood in Los Angeles known as Laurel Canyon. In contrast to the other canyons slicing through the Hollywood Hills, Laurel Canyon has its own market, the semi-famous Laurel Canyon Country Store, its own deli and cleaners, its own elementary school, the Wonderland School, its own boutique shops and salons, and in more recent years, its own celebrity rehab facility named, as you may have guessed it, the Wonderland Center. Wonderland is a very, very coded word, I think. During its heyday, the canyon even had its own management company, Lookout Management, to handle the talent. At one time, it even had its own newspaper. It's pretty good for Laurel Canyon. It's got all that stuff, or it had some of that stuff. One other thing that I should add here is that this has not been an easy line of research for me to conduct, primarily because I have been, for as long as I can remember, a huge fan of 1960s music and culture. Though I didn't come of age, so to speak, until the 1970s, I've always felt as though I was cheated by being denied the opportunity to experience firsthand the era that I was so obviously meant to inhabit. During my high school and college years, while my peers were mostly into faceless corporate rock, think Journey, Foreigner, Kansas, Boston, etc., and perhaps worse yet, the twin horrors of new wave and disco music, I was faithfully spinning my Hendrix, Joplin, and Doors albums, which I still have in the original vinyl versions, while my color organ, remember those, competed with my black light and strobe light. I don't know what a color organ is. I'm assuming it's some kind of keyboard with different colored keys. You have to look that up. Let's see. We'll do that right now. Term color organ refers to a tradition of mechanical devices built to represent sound and accompany music in a visual medium. So that does not really explain it all too much here. It looks like a big light board for a lot of these images that I'm pulling up. Anyway. So Dave McGowan goes on that he grew his hair long until well past the age when it should have been sheared off. And he's talking, I may have even strung beads across the doorway to my room, but it is possible that I am confusing my life with that of Greg Brady, who, as we all remember, once converted his dad's home office into a groovy bachelor pad. Anyway, one of the most difficult aspects of this journey that I have been on for the last 15 years or so has been watching so many of my former idols and mentors fall by the wayside, as it became increasingly clear to me that people who I once thought were the good guys were, in reality, something entirely different. The first to fall, naturally enough, were the establishment figures, the politicians who I once, quite foolishly, looked up to as people who were fighting the good fight within the confines of the system to bring about real change. Though it now pains me to admit this, there was a time when I admired the likes of EGAD's George McGovern and Jimmy Carter, as well as California Paul's Tom Hayden and Jerry Brown. I even had high hopes, oh so many years ago, for, am I really admitting this in print? Bill Clinton. Since I mentioned Jerry Governor Moonbeam Brown, by the way, I must now digress a bit. As luck would have it, Jerry Brown was, curiously enough, a longtime resident of a little place called Laurel Canyon. Oh, sorry, I read that with the wrong inflection. But anyway, Jerry Brown was a longtime resident of Laurel Canyon. As readers of my previous work, Program to Kill, seek it out if you don't have it. Already can recommend this book, even though I haven't read it yet. Program to Kill is a book about serial killers, and I am obsessed with it. But this book, very good. So Program to Kill, as readers of that may recall, Brown lived on Wonderland Avenue, not too many doors down from 8763 Wonderland Avenue, the site of the infamous 4 on the Floor murders, regarded by grizzled LA homicide detectives as the most bloody and brutal multiple murder in the city's very bloody history. As it turns out, the most bloody mass murder in LA's history took place in one of the city's most serene, pastoral, and exclusive neighborhoods. And strangely enough, the case usually cited as the runner-up for the title of bloodiest crime scene, the murders of Stephen Parent, Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Wojtek Frykowski, and Abigail Folger at 10050 Cielo Drive in Benedict Canyon, just a couple of miles to the west of Laurel Canyon, had deep ties to the Laurel Canyon scene as well. So I'll read that again. And strangely enough, the case usually cited as the runner-up, the Manson murders, had deep ties to the Laurel Canyon scene as well. As previously mentioned, victims Folger and Frykowski lived in Laurel Canyon at 2774 Woodstock Road, in a rented home right across the road from a favored gathering spot for Laurel Canyon royalty. Many of the regular visitors to Cass Elliott's home, including a number of shady drug dealers, were also regular visitors to the Folger-Frykowski home. Frykowski's son, by the way, was stabbed to death on June 6, 1999, 30 years after his father met the same fate. That's insane. Victim Jay Sebring's acclaimed hair salon sat right at the mouth of Laurel Canyon, just below the Sunset Strip, and it was Sebring, alas, who is credited with sculpting Jim Morrison's famous mane. One of the investors in his Sebring International business venture was none other than Mr. John Phillips. Sharon Tate was also well known in Laurel Canyon, where she was a frequent visitor to the homes of friends like John Phillips, Cass Elliot, and Abigail Folger. And when she wasn't in Laurel Canyon, many of the canyon regulars, both famous and infamous, made themselves at home at her place on Cielo Drive. Canyonite Van Dyke Parks, for example, dropped by for a visit on the very day of the murders. And Denny Doherty, the other Papa in the Mamas and the Papas, has claimed that he and John Phillips were invited to the Cielo Drive home on the night of the murders, but as luck would have it, they never made it over. So think about that for a second. Denny Doherty from the Mama and the Papas claimed that he and John Phillips were invited over to the Cielo Drive home on the night that Sharon Tate and others were killed. They could have been part of the death toll. You know, it's quite crazy. It's very interesting, and we're gonna get deeper into these connections here. You know, in this book, I have not read it yet. It's actually probably going to be, I don't know, but it's going to be next. But I'm thinking I'm going to do Chaos at some point, which gets much deeper into the Manson thing. And I know that Tom O'Neill, who wrote Chaos, has kind of made some offhand references to Dave McGowan. I think on the Joe Rogan show, he maybe made an allusion to Dave McGowan, or maybe it was someplace else, and he said that certain authors jump to conclusions without meticulous source citing and things like that, and that is a big fault of Dave McGowan. And so I think that there are a lot of things that need to be researched in this book, and I don't think it should be necessarily discredited until these things are really more, research either bears them to be true or untrue. But anyway, yeah. So anyway, similarly, Chuck Negron of Three Dog Night, a regular visitor to the Wonderland Death House, had set up a drug buy on the night of that mass murder, but he fell asleep and never made it over. So that's also another crazy just coincidence. Like, yeah, the guy from Three Dog Night, could have been killed that night as well. I think there's something with Three Dog Night. I don't know if he talks about Three Dog Night in this book at all, but there's definitely some strangeness with that band. I remember listening to interviews with Chuck Negron on the Howard Stern show, and some pretty wild tales. Along with the victims, the alleged killers also lived in and or were very much a part of the Laurel Canyon scene. Bobby Cupid Beausoleil, for example, lived in a Laurel Canyon apartment during the early months of 1969. Charles Tex Watson, who allegedly led the death squad responsible for the carnage at Cielo Drive, lived there for a time in a home on, guess where, Wonderland Avenue. During that time, curiously enough, Watson co-owned and worked in a wig shop in Beverly Hills, Crown Wig Creations Limited, that was located near the mouth of Benedict Canyon. Meanwhile, one of Jay Sebring's primary claims to fame was his expertise in crafting men's hairpieces, which he did in his shop near the mouth of Laurel Canyon. A typical day then in the late 1960s would find Watson crafting hairpieces for an upscale Hollywood clientele near Benedict Canyon, and then returning home to Laurel Canyon, while Sebring crafted hair pieces for an upscale clientele near Laurel Canyon and then returned home to Benedict Canyon. And then one crazy day, as we all know, one of them became a killer and the other his victim. But there's nothing odd about that, I suppose. So let's move on. Oh, wait a minute. We can't quite move on just yet, as I forgot to mention that Sebring's Benedict Canyon home at 9820 Easton Drive was a rather infamous Hollywood death house that had once belonged to Jean Harlow and Paul Byrne. The mismatched pair were wed on July 2nd, 1932, when Harlow, already a huge star of the silver screen, was just 21 years old. Just 2 months later, on September 5th, Byrne caught a bullet to the head in his wife's bedroom. He was found sprawled naked in a pool of his own blood, his corpse drenched with his wife's perfume. Upon discovering the body, Byrne's butler promptly contacted MGM's head of security, Whitey Hendry, who in turn contacted Louis B. Meyer and Irving Thalberg. All three men descended upon the Benedict Canyon home to, tidy up a bit. A couple hours later, they decided to contact the LAPD. This scene would be repeated years later when Sebring's friends would rush to the very same home to clean up before officers investigating the Tate murders arrived. And I know this is LA, but think about it. Think about your house and think about how many murders are connected to your home. Hopefully not a lot. I live in New York, so I honestly have no idea. Byrne's death was, as is so often the case, written off as a suicide. His newlywed wife, strangely enough, was never called as a witness at the inquest. Byrne's other wife, which is to say his common-law wife, Dorothy Millett, reportedly boarded a Sacramento riverboat on September 6, 1932, the day after Paul's death. She was next seen floating belly up in the Sacramento River. Her death, as would be expected, was also ruled a suicide. Less than 25 years later, Harlow herself dropped dead at the ripe old age of 26. At the time, authorities opted not to divulge the cause of death, though it was later claimed that bad kidneys had done her in. At 26, bad kidneys is pretty bad. If there's nothing self-inflicted about that, then that's pretty bad. During her brief stay on this planet, Harlow had cycled through 3 turbulent marriages at 26, and yet still found time to serve as godmother to Bugsy Siegel's daughter, Millicent. Very, very innocent. Though Burns was the most famous body to be hauled out of the Easton Drive house in a coroner's bag, it certainly wasn't the only one. Another man had reportedly committed suicide there as well, in some unspecified fashion. Yet another unfortunate soul drowned in the home's pool, and a maid was once found swinging from the end of a rope. Her death, needless to say, was ruled a suicide as well. That's a lot of blood for one home to absorb, but the house's morbid history, though a turnoff to prospective residents, was reportedly exactly what attracted Jay Sebring to the property. His murder would further darken the black cloud over the home. As Laurel Canyon Michael Walker has noted, LA's 2 most notorious mass murders, one in August of 1969 and the 1981, both involving 5 victims, though at the Wonderland, one of the 5 miraculously survived, provided rather morbid bookends for Laurel Canyon's glory years. Walker, though, like others who have chronicled the time and place, treats these brutal crimes as though they were unfortunate aberrations. The reality, however, is that the 9 bodies recovered from Cielo Drive and Wonderland Avenue constitute just the tip of a very large and very bloody iceberg. To partially illustrate that point, Diane Linkletter, daughter of famed entertainer Art Linkletter, legendary comedian Lenny Bruce, screen idol Sal Mineo, starlet Inger Stevens, and silent film star Raymond Novarro all have something in common. All were found dead in their homes, either in or at the mouth of Laurel Canyon in the decade between 1966 and 1976. And all 5 were, in all likelihood, murdered in those Laurel Canyon homes. Only 2 of them are officially listed as murder victims. Mineo, who was stabbed to death outside his home at 8563 Holloway Drive on February 12th, 1976, and Novarro, who was killed near the country store in a decidedly ritualistic fashion on the eve of Halloween, 1968. Inger Stevens' death in her home at 8000 Woodrow Wilson Drive on April 30th, 1978, Walpurgisnacht on the occult calendar, was officially a suicide, though why she opted to propel herself through a decorative glass screen as part of that suicide remains a mystery. Perhaps she just wanted to leave behind a gruesome crime scene, and simple overdoses can be, bloodless and boring. It's just crazy. I don't think it's really something I like to joke about too much. I don't really like to joke about death all that much, but yeah, no, it's super funny. Not super funny. It's super crazy to the point of being comical how violent the peace and love kind of world ended up being in a way. Diane Linkletter, according to legend, sailed out the window of her Shoreham Towers apartment because, in her LSD-addled state, she thought she could fly. We know this because Art himself told us that it was so, and because the story was retold throughout the 1970s as a cautionary tale about the dangers of drugs. What we weren't told, however, is that Diane, born curiously enough on Halloween Day 1948, wasn't alone when she plunged 6 stories to her death on the morning of October 4th, 1969. Au contraire, she was with a gent by the name of Edward Durston, who, in a completely unexpected turn of events, accompanied actress Carol Wayne to Mexico some 15 years later. Carol, alas, perhaps weighed down by her enormous breasts, managed to drown in barely a foot of water, while Mr. Durston promptly disappeared. That's horrific. To joke about that in that way is horrific. As would be expected, he was never questioned by authorities about Wayne's curious death. After all, it is quite common for the same guy to be the sole witness to 2 separate accidental deaths. Art also neglected to mention that just weeks before Diane's curious death, another member of the Linkletter clan, Art's son-in-law, John Zweier, caught a bullet to the head in the backyard of his Hollywood Hills home. But that, of course, was an unconnected suicide. Quite crazy. I'm not even going to discuss here the circumstances of Lenny Bruce's death from acute morphine poisoning on August 3rd, 1966, but because, to be perfectly honest, I don't know too many people who don't already assume that Lenny was whacked. I'll just note here that his funeral was well attended by the Laurel Canyon rock icons and control over his unreleased material fell into the hands of a guy by the name of Frank Zappa, another unsavory character named Phil Spector, whose crack team of studio musicians, dubbed the Wrecking Crew, were the actual musicians playing on many studio recordings by Laurel Canyon bands as the Monkees, the Byrds, the Beach Boys, and the Mamas and the Papas. So yeah, that's insane. Okay. I'm going to go on here to the next chapter, which I think is going to be, I'm going to call it after the next chapter. Shorter one than last time, I think. And I think I'm going to do this again tomorrow, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and then take next Wednesday, Thursday, Friday off because I'll be out of town. But we'll see. So this is chapter 3. Dig, the Laurel Canyon Death List. I mean, fuck. He auditioned for Neil, for fuck's sake. Graham Nash explaining to author Michael Walker how close Charles Manson was to the Laurel Canyon scene. He's talking about Neil Young. During the 10-year period during which Lenny Bruce, Raymond Novarro, Sal Mineo, Diane Linkletter, Inger Stevens, Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Wojtek Frykowski, and Abigail Folger all turned up dead, numerous other people connected to Laurel Canyon did as well, often under very questionable circumstances. The list includes, but is certainly not limited to all of the following names: Marina Elizabeth Habe, whose body was carved up and tossed into the heavy brush along Mulholland Drive, just west of Beaumont Drive on December 30, 1968. Habe, just 17 at the time of her death, was the daughter of Hans Habe, who emigrated to the U.S. from fascist Austria circa 1940. Shortly thereafter, Hans married a General Foods heiress and began studying psychological warfare at the Military Intelligence Training Center. After completing his training, he put his psychological warfare skills to use by creating 18 newspapers in occupied Germany, under the direction, no doubt, of the OSS. I don't know too much about Hans Habe, I think it is, actually. Hans Habe was certainly an OSS guy who, I can't remember what his deal was. I can't remember if he was creating pro-fascist newspapers and to then discredit fascism by being so outrageous or something, or whether he was doing anti-fascist. But yeah, Hans Habe, Peter Levenda has written about him, I'm pretty sure. Christine Hinton, who was killed in a head-on collision on September 30th, 1969. At the time, Hinton was a girlfriend of David Crosby and the founder and head of the Byrds fan club. She was also the daughter of a career Army officer stationed at the notorious Presidio military base in San Francisco. Another of Crosby's girlfriends from that same era was Shelley Roker, who grew up on the Hamilton Air Force Base in Marin County. Next on the death list, Jane Doe number 59, found dumped into the heavy undergrowth of Laurel Canyon in November 1969, within sight of where Habe had been dumped less than a year earlier. The teenage girl, who was never identified, had been stabbed 157 times in the chest and throat. Alan Blind Owl Wilson, singer, songwriter, and guitarist for the Laurel Canyon blues rock band Canned Heat, was found dead in his Topanga Canyon home on September 3rd, 1970. His death was written off as a suicide/OD. Wilson had moved to Topanga Canyon after the band's Laurel Canyon home on Lookout Mountain Avenue, next door to Joni Mitchell and Graham Nash's home, burned to the ground. Blind Owl was just 27 years old at the time of his death. A little more than a decade later, Wilson's former bandmate, Bob the Bear Height, who had once acknowledged in an interview that he had partied in the canyons with various members of the Manson family, died of a heart attack at the ripe old age of 36. Jimi Hendrix, who reportedly briefly occupied the sprawling mansion just north of the log cabin after he moved to LA in 1968, died in London under seriously questionable circumstances on September 18th, 1970. Though he rarely spoke of it, Jimmy had served a stint in the U.S. Army with the 101st Airborne Division at Fort Campbell. His official records indicate that he was forced into the service by the courts and then released after just 1 year when he purportedly proved to be a poor soldier. One wonders, though, why he was assigned to such an elite division if he was indeed such a failure. One also wonders why he wasn't subjected to disciplinary measures rather than being handed a free pass out of his ostensibly court-ordered service. In any event, Jimmy himself once told reporters that he was given a medical discharge after breaking an ankle during a parachute jump. One biographer has claimed that Jimmy faked being gay to earn an early release. The truth, alas, remains rather elusive. I'm going to look up and see right now. 101st Airborne. The 101st Airborne Division, nicknamed the Screaming Eagles, is an elite light infantry division of the United States Army specializing in air assault operations, with the capability to conduct long-range operations into combat zones using aircraft. Yeah, that's insane. There's no way. There's no way that he was not more than he said. Anyway, at the time of Jimmy's death, the first person called by his girlfriend, Monica Danneman, last to see Hendrix alive, was Eric Burden of the Animals. 2 years earlier, Burden had relocated to LA and taken over ringmaster duties from Frank Zappa after Zappa had vacated the log cabin and moved into a less high-profile Laurel Canyon home. Within a year of Jimmy's death, a reported prostitute turned groupie named Devin Wilson, who had been with Jimmy the day before his death, plunged from an 8th-floor window of New York's Chelsea Hotel. On March 5th, 1973, a shadowy character named Michael Jeffrey, who had managed both Hendrix and Burden, was killed in a mid-air plane collision. Jeffrey was known to openly boast of having organized crime connections and of working for the CIA. Stuffy. After Jimmy's death, it was discovered that Jeffrey had been funneling most of Hendrix's gross earnings into offshore accounts in the Bahamas linked to international drug trafficking. Oh, this is a longer chapter. I am going to run in a minute, so I'm going to put a pin in this after this one. Okay, so with Hendrix, years later, on April 5th, 1966, Danneman, the daughter of a wealthy German industrialist, was found dead near her home in a few Mercedes. So we're going to stop here on page 32, or I'm going to stop here. You keep reading if you want, just because I have to get running. But yeah, we'll go on further tomorrow. But definitely just wild stuff. This Hendrix thing has me kind of chomping at the bit to go down a research rabbit hole and see if there's any more info on what his exact military career entailed. And it's kind of interesting because Hendrix, yeah, I read this in a zine once. Someone said something like about all these hippies having songs about murder. And, Hendrix, Hey Joe, and I know he did not write that song, but that's a song about, going off to kill your wife and running down to Mexico. It's quite interesting. There's a lot of other strange things with Hendrix, the Beatles. All these guys have kind of strange pasts and connections and things like that. And yeah, hopefully we can dig in. Anyway, I hope someone listens to this, has fun. If not, I don't give a shit. But if anyone made it this far, God bless you. And yeah, just sending my love from on high to anyone out there watching. And bye-bye.